Hey, what's up, y'all? It's your boy Preston here, and this is my post-fight reaction to Sebastian Fundora stopping Tszyu in the seventh round and beating Tszyu the second time in the rematch, and putting a period in that note that Sebastian Fundora is the better fighter, and stuff like that, and that's the thing, and stuff like that, Um, but basically, hold on, be right back. But yeah, we back, man, and stuff like that, but Sebastian Fundora, bro. Man, bro, like Sebastian Fundora, bro. Like, bro, I like the thing is though is that I know this dude is a weight bully, but like what can he do? It's like he's a natural 154 pounder. You know what I'm saying? It's like what can he do at 160? And shit like that. He would get crushed at 160. And shit like that. People are just expecting Sebastian to go to 160. No, bro. And shit like that. It's like he makes the weight of what he makes, and shit like that. You know what I mean? But the one thing though is that I know that Sebastian, he definitely walks around like around like he walks around at 160, and shit like that. Like if you look at it, like 160, 170 on some good days 180, and shit like that, but it's just like still like people who are naturally 160, they be walking around like at like 200 pounds, and shit like that, sometimes over that a little bit, and shit like that, like that's the thing. Well, I wouldn't say over that, and stuff like that, but I'm just saying, bro, and shit like that, but I mean, the thing though is that he could test it out, but it's just like, I just don't see it his division, it's just like, I see, just him as a natural 154 pounder. I'm sorry that he's super tall, but it's just, God gives people the way that they get the way how he gives people, and shit like that, and he's a tall dude, 6'7", 6'6", 6'7", and then he weighs 154 pounds, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, it's like. So, like Sebastian gets a lot of love, but gets also a lot of hate too, and shit like that, But it just, what can you do about it, and shit like that? It's just like, I mean, yeah, you could pack on some weight, and shit like that. I mean, you see Hamza Shiraz, and shit like that, and then now you're seeing, Terrence Crawford, bulked up and shit like that, But it's just more of like I'm just saying, man, and shit like that. It's like I don't really see any complaints with him at 154, and shit like that because it's like he could still get beat, by these 154 pounders, these small 154 pounders to him, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? But it's just more of like, he's that good, bro. It's just like I know he's tall. I know he's a tall motherfucker. He's really tall, and shit like that, but it's just he still gets to work, it's just like he still is 154, and stuff like that, it's like that's the thing and shit like that, it's like, you know, I mean that's a big 154 pounder, and stuff like that, but it's just more of like he's 154, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? It's like that's the thing and shit like that. He would still be fucking like amazingly tall to even people in the middleweight division. You know what I'm saying? But it's just more of like at the end of the day, I just don't think it matters, and shit like that. It doesn't matter, and stuff like that of basically of what weight class Sebastian Fundora goes into, and stuff like that, and yeah, and stuff like that, but 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 basically that's the thing, and shit like that, and with Tszyu. Tszyu, he's a good fighter, and stuff like that, But he will never in a million years would ever beat Sebastian Fundora, and shit like that. I feel like it would just prove it in this fight, and shit like that, that he would just like never in it. Like, I feel like in the first fight, it's just like, I just feel like Sebastian did him well, and shit like that enough where, he got, Tim Zoo's number, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And like that's the thing and shit like that. But put Tim Zoo against people like Erickson Lubin, put people against, people like fucking, whoever the fuck is at 154. Even Terrence Crawford, he would put a really good fight against Terrence, even though he ain't beating my boy Terrence, and shit like that, especially if you're gonna get laid out by Sebastian, and shit like that. I know Sebastian, he's a big dude, blah blah blah, but Crawford is a big dude with those punches and shit like that, and like that's the thing and shit, But it would stylistically be not as more like it would be more competitive, I will say, and shit like that, because Sebastian is just tall, man. It's just that's how he wins, is by just crushing people, and shit like that. Is that like that's how he wins, and shit like that, is by just continuously hitting you and shit like that. It's just like he stopped Erickson Lubin, Tim Zhu, like this dude is a motherfucker, bro. Like literally, like this dude is a bro, Sebastian Fundora, bro, like literally, like, and he's such a nice guy too, and shit like that, And the one thing though is that like I need to see more of of his little sister's fights, cause she could bang, bro, and shit like that, Like I remember when I seen her fight, like. She's one of my favorite women fighters, and shit like that, Like, she almost obviously reminds me of Sebastian Fundora. But, Fundora kind of... But the one thing that Gabrielle Fundora reminds me of a little bit is kind of like like almost like Muhammad Ali a little bit, and shit like that, But they both kind of remind like me of a Muhammad Ali a little bit. You know how they keep their hands low and they more just kind of like to keep their distance, and shit like that, like, but, that's the thing and shit like that. But they're both pretty big for their weight class, mainly Sebastian, and shit like that, But Gabrielle's also, tall, is also like tall and mainly lengthy. She has incredibly long arms, and stuff like that can hit you from long range and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, you don't want to get in the middle of those. But I'm just saying, like, just shout out to Gabrielle Fundora. I think that's her name, right? Gabrielle, and shit like that. I think that's her name, is Gabrielle Fundora, and shit like that, But yeah, let me actually go look. Gabriella Fundora. That's her name, and shit like that, But she's a good fighter though, and stuff like that, But yeah. But it ain't over for Tim Zhu though. It really ain't over for Tim Zhu. But Tim Zhu definitely got like, there's definitely levels for Tim Zhu, man. And shit like that, Like a tad bit, I do think Tim Zhu is just a tad bit overrated. But it just, the one thing is that he still will make it like George Kambosos, he'll still make it a tough fight, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? Like, he'll still manage to make it, make things, like high anticipated to watch. He's still watchable to watch. Because he's a big name, because his dad was Kostya Tszyu. He was a really good fighter. And Tim Tszyu, we know that he's a good fighter and that he can be good, with fights and stuff like that, But it's just more of like, it really just depends on the fight that Sebastian Tim Tszyu is in, you know what I'm saying? And shit like that, because like, I'm just saying, bro, because it's just like, I just feel like, with Tim Tszyu, it's like, he could have been able to, to throw more punches in this fight, but it just, I understand, because it's just, he was just getting smacked up by those punches, bro, and shit like that, just like, you have to be like technically sound, You know what I mean? To be able to actually compete with Fundora. You know what I mean? And Tszyu, he isn't technically sound, and shit like that. Like Tszyu, he's not really technically sound, and shit like that. And that's the thing and shit like that. It's like he's more just a stand and bang type of fighter. But the one thing though is, he could take a punch, but it's just his chin. At the end of the day, it's just like he like it's his chin, but it's just more of just like, it's just everything. It's just like he's so open with his face, and shit like that. It's just like it's so easy to hit Tszyu, and shit like that. It's like that's the thing. Like even fucking Terrell, like, and all respect to Terrell Goucher, and shit like that. You are a great fighter, and shit like that, and I feel like that, that Terrell Goucher is gonna eventually start showing people that, that, I mean, obviously people know Terrell Goucher is a good fighter, but I mean, I like eventually he'll get him a good win, and shit like that. It should, like, I need to rewatch that fight against Elijah Garcia, but but a lot of people were saying how what's his name, how Terrell Goucher got robbed in that fight, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, so it's like that could have really been his win right there, but either way, what I'm just saying is that, Tszyu supposed to be, is like people had high hopes on Tszyu, like he was about to be like an undisputed champ or some shit, you know what I mean? But it's just more of like, the one thing that they did right with Tszyu is that he's still watchable, and shit like that. He's still very watchable, extremely watchable, and shit like that, because he could still knock you out any moment, and shit like that, he still knows what to do to win, and shit like that, it's like, there's still styles of fights where he could still win, and, those opportunities are still out there where it could really show people that, Tszyu ain't going nowhere, and shit like that. But I know that at the end of the day, Sebastian, is gonna, like, if he's that good, Sebastian gonna fight him again and shit like that, and then defeat him. But a lot of boxers like to duck each other, and shit like that, and I know that there is no way in hell that Tszyu is gonna just get happily in there with Sebastian Fundora again, and shit like that. I don't even think he's gonna want to fight him again. Because that's why he quit. Because it wasn't where the ref stopped it. He literally quit. Like he said, it was when he was in the corner. He said he didn't want to fight no more. And shit like that. It's like, let me get the picture. Here it is right here, and stuff like that, because you have Harvey Dock right there, he has his hand and he's waving and stuff like that, because what happened was because honestly, before that happened, Tszyu, before that round ended, he caught Sebastian with a nice little shot where he kind of ended the round with a good note. He still lost, but he ended the round with a good note, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? But it's just more of like, I was, down here, and shit like that, smoking, my stuff, and shit like that with and then with me, and then my dad, and with my mom, and my dad, like, and shit like that, he's seen how, Sebastian, how, Tszyu, like, before he went to the stool, he just seemed like he just didn't want to fight, and shit like that. It just, he didn't want to fight at all, and shit like that. It's just like, almost like, it's just like, like me and my dad been watching, I've been watching boxing for, I mean, my dad been watching boxing for all of his life. I've been watching boxing for all of my life, and shit like that, so I mean, like, we both know what it is when a boxer doesn't want to continue anymore, and shit like that, because overall, when it comes down to me, my memory around 12 years, but overall, all my life I've been watching boxing, and shit like that, according to my dad, and shit like that. But I do remember glimpses and shit like that, But I've always been tuned into it, and shit like that, Just I was small, but all my life I've been into. But basically, that's not the point. I've been watching boxing for all of my life, and that's the reason why I know that why Tszyu, and shit like that, why, like how my dad, he knew that with his boxing experience, because he been watching boxing for, because my dad is 45 years old. He been watching boxing for 45 fucking years, and shit like, or about 40 years, and shit like that, He knows when a boxer doesn't want to continue anymore. Tszyu did not want to continue, bro. And shit like that. Because his eyes, bro, he was like, man, dude, it's just like, he didn't know, like, it's just like, it's almost like, it's just like, those punches were just, it's just like he felt those punches, and shit like that. It's just like, obviously you feel those punches, but it was almost like he would have rather to get knocked out than to just keep on feeling those punches, and shit like that, and because you never know, even high, like, just keeping on of just getting hit, eventually that's going to put on brain damage into your head. Again, this is my knowledge I would say, 18, 17, 15, 14, 13, I would say, like, of my 11 years of me watching boxing, literally, it's like, you can't, like, that type of punishment will put all that damage into your brain, and shit like that, and can, like, look at Maxim Dadashev, you know what I mean? He's still, like he had to be on a stretcher, and shit like that, you know what I mean? So it wasn't as bad, but it was because he took so many punches. He didn't get knocked out. You know what I'm saying? This is what I'm saying. Like, Tszyu didn't get knocked out. And that's the same thing for Dadashev. Dadashev didn't get knocked out, and shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, But all those punches that hit you is going to impact you. You know what I'm saying? So it's like, that's the thing and shit like that, So it's like, it just, Tszyu, like, with his type of style of fighting against the towering Inferno, and shit like that, Like, what could it be done? And shit like that. It's like, it's just like he wasn't quicker than Sebastian, because Sebastian overall, when you got both quick fighters, and shit like that, but one fighter is significantly taller than you and shit like that, basically way bigger than you, and shit like that, like, those shots are gonna go in, are gonna get in more quicker than the other person, that's more shorter, because it's like, because their arm is closer, because they could reach their face, and shit like that, like, easier than somebody that has like, that's more smaller, and shit like that, because it's like, what I'm saying and shit like that, because, like, when you hit, and stuff like that, when you hit, and stuff like that, how do I explain it, and shit like that, cause like, when you hit and you're the taller fighter, and shit like that, and why it gets there quicker is because it's like, your own range, and shit like that, when your own range, like, the other fighter doesn't have the range, and shit like that. So it's like, naturally, it's just like a simple jab. Boop, boop, boop. While the other person has to literally lunge to throw their punch, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing with Tszyu and Sebastian Fundora, and stuff like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, But overall, like, I feel like, that Tszyu did the right thing, bro. And shit like that. Because What could have happened? There could have been a lot of things that could have happened. Like in that fight, like he like like in the more that Tszyu kept throwing, it just would turn more and more into what happened in the first fight, where Fundora was just beating up, you was just beating the living shit out of Tszyu, and shit like that. I mean, they were both beating each other up, but well, I mean, I would say it like this: so Fundora was beating up Tszyu, but Tszyu was still fighting the bully. You know what I'm saying? He was still fighting back, showing that he ain't a slouch. You know what I mean? But like that's basically what happened. And shit like that. And that's the thing. But basically, it was about to turn into that. And Tszyu was like, nah, fuck that. And shit like that. Like I ain't finna, go and do none of that shit, and shit like that. I got a family to take care of, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And yeah, and shit like that, and basically, that's the thing and shit like that, so I'm just saying, bro, and shit like that, but Zoo still got some fights, to to have, out there, and shit like that. And he definitely got opportunities out there to fight. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing and shit like that. And yeah, and shit like that. But leave Sebastian Fundora alone, bro. And shit like that. You are not beating Sebastian Fundora. And stuff like that. He is too tall and just stylistically, but with your technique, with the way how you fight, you're not beating Sebastian. I'm not like obviously. I mean, he's a boxer, and shit like that. It's like, all boxers would beat the living shit out of most people in the world, and shit like that. I'm not questioning anything of how Tszyu can fight, and shit like that. Like he would knock me out, and shit like that. Like he's bigger than me and shit. I'm pretty small. I'm taller. Like as for my weight, I'm like 5'8", and stuff like that. Like 5'8.5", but I'm like 120 pounds. I'm pretty, larger for my size, and shit like that, But it's just like against Tszyu, yeah, no, and shit like that. Even though knowing me, I'm gonna do what I do, but I'm just saying, Tszyu would destroy a lot of these fighters, but it just even a lot of these really good fighters, but not Sebastian Fundora. And I'm just saying that right now, and shit like that, and that's the thing and shit like that, But let's go round by round for what happened in the fight. So honestly, the whole fight, Fundora was just destroying Tszyu, and shit like that, fighting from the outside, throwing the jab, and shit like that, and really, and the one thing that he was doing well was that he was timing where he was jabbing and shit like that, and then he went to winding his shots, and shit like that. And the one time where he winded his shot, he dropped Tszyu, and shit like that, and that's basically what he did and shit like that, and then he just started just picking Tszyu apart the whole time. Tszyu, he was throwing back. But Fundora was just, like, it was basically like the first fight. I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys watched the fight, but it was basically like the first fight, and shit like that, belt to ass, and shit like that, but in this fight, he mentally got to Tszyu, because Fundora, he was really ready, and he was about to, really tear up some shit, didn't give a fuck, even if he had to, like, go in a bloody mess, and shit like that, and honestly, when, going into the fight, Tszyu was, I feel like when he's seen of how much blood that there was in that fight, I feel like that terrified him. That didn't really motivate him, I feel like, and shit like that. Because if he did this, that did not motivate him, and shit like that. While Fundora, man, that just made that boy more hungrier, and shit like that. But it's just more because he wasn't really cut up in that fight. You know what I'm saying? Like, he wasn't cut up in the fight. He had, like, a little bruises here and there and shit like that, you know. Like Fundora always gets at least like bruises somewhere, you know, and shit like that, you know. But it's just his opponent that he fights always gets the worst of everything, you know, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know. And you know, he was smiling at how much blood there was, you know, and shit like that. So it's just like that shows that Fedor was just he was more ready in this fight, bro. You know, he was more mentally ready to for a war, you know, and shit like that. Tszyu wasn't mentally ready for a war like that, you know, and shit like that, because he's ready for a war, but a war like that where you know like where like you don't even know that if he can make it home, you know, and shit like that, you know. Like I'm just saying, bro. Cause look at his fucking face. It was round 7, and look at his fucking face, bro. Like literally, like that looks like already like a 12-round fight, or that you just got jumped by like 10 other like 10 people, you know, and shit like that, you know. Well, I wouldn't say like 3 other people or 2 other people, you know, and shit like that, you know. Like I'm just saying, no, bro. That's Sebastian Fundora that put all of that bruises, all of the scars and bruises in on that face, bro. You know, and shit like that. Like I am just saying, bro. Sebastian Fundora is, you know, like I'm just saying, bro. Like he's that dude, man. He is that dude. You know, and shit like that. And you know, and the one thing though, he needs to fight that one Russian guy that Tszyu lost to, you know, and shit like that. What's his name? Oh fuck, what's his name, bro? Hold up. This motherfucker, you know, and shit like that. Bakram Murtsaliev. This is oh shit. This is who Sebastian Fundora needs to fight next. You know, because Bakram, he wants to fight you know, he wants to fight Jermel Charlo, you know, and shit like that. You know, it's like Jermel Charlo, you know, it's like I don't like you know, it's like that's way too early, you know, and shit like that, you know, because it's like you know, like because like I'm just saying that is way too early, you know, because like he needs a little warm up fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, and I don't think he ain't getting the Charlo fight, you know, and shit like that. Unless if he really does get the Charlo fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. But I'm just saying, you know, and shit like that. But what I really think should happen though, you know, and shit like that, you know, is Sebastian Fundora versus Bakram Mortsaliev. Because both of these guys have belts. Because I believe Sebastian also got the interim WBC belt. Because I don't know why he got 2 WBC belts. And he's only been in one weight class, which is the super welterweight division, you know, and shit like that, you know. And at least like, you know, when it comes down to getting a belt, only one division. But I think he's only been in one division of the super welterweight division, you know, and shit like that. So that other belt that he has to be has to be like the interim, you know, and shit like that. That got to be like the that got to be like the WBC interim that he has, but then also the WBC regular that he has, you know, and shit like that, you know. So that's the thing and shit like that. While, you know, Bakram Murtsaliev, he has the IBF belt, you know, and shit like that, you know. So basically, this fight makes sense, bro, you know, and shit like that, you know. This fight really does make sense, you know, and I feel like that, you know, Murtsaliev, like I tad bit think Murtsaliev maybe is ducking Sebastian Fundora, because he hasn't really like referenced Fundora's name like that, really. You know, he literally went out of par and wanted to just pick on old Jermel Charlo. Like Jermel hasn't fought in a minute. Like he hasn't like trained like that. I bet you. Like he hasn't fought in a minute. He wants to fight Jermel Charlo, probably for a good paycheck. But, you know, but I'm just saying, you know, and shit like that, you know. But Sebastian, I'm just saying, like, I know the paycheck won't be as high, but still, your name will still be, like, will still be the same and shit like that, you know. And it's a very competitive fight. And I just, like, you know, he hasn't referenced his name really, Bakram Murtsaliev. And I know he knows who the fuck Sebastian Fundora is, and I know he knows what he's about, and shit like that. You know what I'm saying? So it's like that's the thing and shit like that. So it's like I'm just saying because they both fought Tszyu around the same time, and shit like that. Like I think it was like that's the thing and shit like that. And yeah, and shit like that. Because yeah, and shit like that. So that's the thing, man. It's shit like that, So it's like I just say, bro, and shit like that. I think this would be a good fight stylistically, and shit like that. Like Murtsaliev, he immediately just got rid of Tszyu, and shit like that. Like I don't know how that fight was like lasted all of those rounds. Probably because people like cause the ref was probably just in shock. Like they probably thought, is Tszyu gonna throw something? But it's just like now just realizing it, absolutely not, he ain't gonna throw something. And shit like that, And that's the thing and shit like that, So that's the thing, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And I'm just saying, man, and shit like that, because it makes sense, and stuff like that. PBC can easily make this fight. PBC, Turkey Alashake, and stuff like that, because Turkey Alashake is the one guy, and shit like that, that he is known to making fights from different promotions, that he collabs fighters from different promotions, and shit like that, to make a fight happen. And shit like that. Unless if I might be mistaken. And stuff like that, you know what I'm saying? But I'm just saying though and shit like that because overall, because I want to see what background Murtsaliev is going to do about the size of Sebastian. Because I know he's going to swing, but what is he going to do about, when Sebastian is he could do, like, he could fight in the inside too, and shit like that, Like, he could, like, he could be able to throw his power shots too to make you not do anything to him, and he can control the fight too, and shit like that. But that's vice versa. And the one thing, though, with Sebastian Fundora that he was doing a lot in the Tszyu fight, and that he overall does a lot, and shit like that, is that he doesn't like to, he doesn't put up his hand, like, he's not really smart on timing any punches and putting his hand up, and shit like that, and blocking it, and then punching. He really just takes the punch, bro. Like, you could tell that he knows the punch is coming, but it's just he takes the punch, and shit like that, and that's the thing, and shit like that, it's like, for how high of a quality of a fighter Sebastian Fundora is, like, he needs to, like, like, block those moments, because when you going against Murtsaliev, bro, that is good night punches right there, bro. Like, I am just saying, like you don't gotta tell me twice that those are gonna be some good night punches right there, and shit like that, And that's the thing, shit like that, and I'm just saying, bro, shit like that, so, yeah, man, shit like that, great win from Sebastian, from beating Tszyu, but this fight, this is the only fight that I want to see, and shit like that, because, both of these fighters got power, and shit like that, both of these fighters have unanswered questions. How is Murtsaliev gonna deal with with the height difference, and stuff like that, and in the power, of Fundora, and stuff like that, and how is Fundora gonna handle on the power of Murtsaliev too, you know, and shit like that, and how is he gonna be, and also how is he gonna be able to deal with it. So both of these fighters have the same things to answer, but the one thing is Fundora, he's been knocked out before, you know, and shit like that. He's been laid out before, you know, and shit like that by a nobody, you know, and shit like that. I mean, Brian Mendoza, he could fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, but I really, but like I'm just saying, you know, I know he lost to Sergey Boachuk. Boachuk is a great fighter, really good fighter, you know, and shit like that. Extremely crafty fighter, you know, and shit like that, you know. But it just, you know, at the same time though, and shit like that, you know, who was I talking about and shit like that, you know, fuck, you know, and shit like that. You know, I don't know why I brought Sergey Boachuk up, you know, and shit like that, you know, but I'm just saying though, you know, and shit like that, you know, but this is gonna be a war, you know, and shit like that, you know. But I'm just saying though, you know, and shit like that, you know, this is gonna be an all out war, you know, and shit like that. And I'm just saying, bro, you know, and shit like that, you know, because both these fighters have power, but Fundora, he's gonna be the distance manager. He's like, but at the same time, I do see Fundora wanting to be cocky and try to get into the inside and show, oh, I can fight you in the inside, blah blah blah, you know, and shit like that, and just get smacked up by a punch, you know, and shit like that, you know, because he's gonna have to be on his tippy toes and have to fight from the range. So he's gonna be the outside fighter, and but you know, but then I was about to say Makachev, Islam Makachev, fucking fuck, what's his name and shit like that? Damn it, oh my gosh, what's his name? Oh my gosh, dude, hold up, what? Like, I can't believe I forgot this motherfucker's name. Bakram Murtsaliev, Bakram Murtsaliev, Bakram Murtsaliev, Bakram Murtsaliev, Bakram Murtsaliev, you know, and shit like that, you know. But basically, Bakram Murtsaliev, you know, and shit like that, you know, like, he's gonna be the aggressor, you know, and shit like that, you know. But I wonder how he's gonna be able to play it, you know, because if he's uncomfortable, that's the thing. But he's gonna be the aggressor in the fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. He is gonna be the aggressor in the fight, you know, and shit like that, you know. But it's just, how do you know that he's gonna answer all of these questions, you know, and shit like that, just off of one win, really fucking good win against Tszyu, you know, because Tszyu is a very good fighter, you know, and shit like that, you know, which. So that's a very good win, you know, and shit like that, you know, from Bakram Murtsaliev, you know, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know. But other than that, like, I haven't really seen much, you know, and shit like that. And like that's the thing and shit like that. Like, and you're going against Sebastian Fundora. And now that we know, Sebastian Fundora is levels over Tszyu, you know, and shit like that, you know. So it's like, and overall, Murtsaliev, he proved that he's levels over Tszyu also, you know, and shit like that, you know, obviously. So it's like, I'm just saying, bro, you know, and shit like that. Please make this fight, bro, you know, and shit like that. This fight gotta happen, you know, and shit like that, you know, like, I've been saying this fight from the get-go, you know, and shit like that. I was actually rather wanting to see this fight rather than seeing, you know, Sebastian run it back with Tszyu. Because I felt like Sebastian made it well clear that he won that fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, like, there shouldn't be any need to really have to run that back like that when he clearly won that fight, you know, and shit like that, you know what I mean? And that's the thing and shit like that, you know, so, but in this fight, this is something that can go either way, you know, and shit like that, you know, and that's the thing, you know, and shit like that, you know, but yeah, you know, and shit like that, you know, but yeah, man, you know, and shit like that, you know, but that is it for me, man, you know, and shit like that, you know, I'm also gonna upload another video and shit like that, you know. I gotta talk about the Isak Cruz fight, you know, and shit like that, you know, and, you know, I need to get that video done, you know, and shit like that, you know, so, um, yeah, man, and shit like that, you know, and, but thank y'all for watching this video, man, and I really appreciate y'all, you know, and shit like that. I really do appreciate y'all, you know, and shit like that, you know, because, you know, because, you know, life sometimes can get you sometimes and shit like that, you know what I'm saying, you know, and shit like that. So it's just, you know, like, you gotta know how to rebound, double back, you know, and shit like that, you know, and just do what you gotta do, you know, and shit like that, you know. But but yeah, you know, and shit like that, you know, because you know, like, you know, because if you love somebody and shit like that, you know, no matter if it's, you know, your girlfriend, like, no matter if it's your mom, no matter if it's your dad, no matter if it's your girlfriend, no matter who it is in your family, dude, just tell them how much you love them, you know, and shit like that, you know, and you know, and that's the thing, you know, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying, and you know, and that's the thing, you know, and shit like that, you know, and yeah, you know, and shit like that, you know, because you know, there's some people, you know, out there that sometimes I would just want to, you know, tell them again, you know, that I love them, you know, and shit like that, you know, but yeah, you know, and shit like that, you know, but I'm just saying, you know, you feel me? But I'm just saying, you feel me, you know, and shit like that, you know, but just wanted to, you know, speak my true feelings, you know, and shit like that, but you know, cause I appreciate y'all and shit like that, you know, but thank y'all for, you know, for watching this video. Again, I'm trying to get to 100 subscribers, you know, and shit like that. You know, I'm almost there, you know, and shit like that. You know, I'm almost to 70 subscribers, so that's good. But the goal is 100, you know, and shit like that. So let's get to 100, you know, and shit like that, you know. So that's the thing and shit like that, you know. So the goal is 100 subscribers. You know, like, I'm making, you know, good quality videos for you guys, you know, like good content for you guys, doing what I can, doing what I do, you know, and shit like that, you know, and yeah, man, you know, and shit like that, you know, trying to make a living off of this, you know, and shit like that, you know what I'm saying? And yeah, you know, and stuff like that, you know, but make sure you guys like and subscribe again. I'm Preston, and peace out, man. About to go on to my other video.